Jonathan Rhys, a car empire mogul disguised in faded jeans, steps into his own luxury dealership, only to be mocked and dismissed by smug staff who peg him as a nobody. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting faint golden streaks across the towering glass walls of the car dealership, where luxury vehicles stood like steel warriors in a gleaming arena. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished leather, mingling with the warm, rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a whisper of wealth that lingered in every corner. Soft jazz drifted from hidden ceiling speakers, curling around the sleek, cold curves of the cars, blending with the sharp tap of expensive dress shoes on a black marble floor that shimmered like a frozen lake under chandelier light. This wasn't just a showroom. It was a temple of extravagance, where each car was a deity on display, every glance a judgment, every sound a tick in a high-stakes game of power. The glass doors hissed open like the sigh of some ancient machine, and a man stepped in, his silhouette slicing through this perfect scene like a stray inkblot on silk. His faded gray polo clung to a sturdy frame. His jeans were worn and patched with time's fingerprints. His scuffed sneakers looked like they trudged through desert storms. He paused beside his silver coupe, its metallic sheen catching the deep, burning glint in his eyes, dark as a dry well, alive with a fire no one noticed. His hand brushed the car's surface, slow and deliberate, like he was coaxing a buried memory awake. Across the room, a young salesman in a slick navy suit shot him a look, sharp as a switchblade. He muttered to a coworker, smirk cutting through. His words, "Check out this guy. Probably thinks this is a junkyard he can rummage through." He turned on his heel, striding toward a glossy black SUV parked out front, where a well-dressed couple waited. Exuding the confidence of winners, the man heard it all, but his lips just twitched into a thin, razor-edged smile. "They never learn," he murmured to himself, voice low like thunder rolling in from a distant horizon. His gaze flickered, cold and dangerous, a storm brewing beneath a calm sky. Who was he in this temple of pride, and what waited behind those smug glass walls? The man stood there, still as a shadow, his fingers lingering on the silver coupe's smooth flank as the showroom buzzed around him like a hive of polished bees. He didn't flinch at the salesman's jab or the dismissive glances that followed. He'd seen this dance before too many times to count, and it didn't rattle him. His name was Jonathan Rhys, though no one here knew it yet. To them, he was just a nobody in a faded polo, a guy who'd wandered into the wrong zip code. But Jonathan wasn't some lost soul. He was the architect of this empire, the owner of a luxury car chain that stretched across state lines like a spiderweb of steel and ambition. And yet, here he was, dressed like he'd just rolled out of a mechanic's garage, testing the waters of his own creation. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a neighborhood where the air smelled of oil and sweat, not leather and coffee. His mom pulled double shifts as a nurse, her hands rough from scrubbing hospital floors. His dad ran a small auto shop, a cramped little joint where the bills piled higher than the profits. At 15, Jonathan was elbow-deep in engines, learning how a carburetor gasped for air, how a transmission groaned under load, how a well-tuned car could purr like it respected you back. But it wasn't just metal he figured out. It was people. He watched how they treated his old man gruff but fared differently when a sharp-dressed customer rolled in. One memory stuck like grease under his nails. Mr. Dawson, a big-shot businessman who'd pull up in a spotless black Cadillac, all smiles and handshakes. Everyone scrambled to please him. Then one day, Dawson showed up in work boots and a beat-up pickup, and suddenly he was invisible. That flipped a switch in Jonathan. He swore he'd never let appearances call the shots. By 25, he'd scraped together enough cash to open a used car lot, a dusty patch of gravel with a single rule: treat every customer like they mattered, whether they drove a rust bucket or a Rolls-Royce. People noticed. Word spread. By 30, he turned that lot into a chain, then a luxury empire, raking in millions without ever trading his jeans for a suit. He didn't flaunt it, never had. To him, wealth was a tool, not a crown. That's why he made these visits, slipping into his dealerships unannounced, blending in with the crowd. Anyone could kiss up to the boss. He wanted to see what happened when they thought no one important was watching. The showroom around him was a cathedral of excess. Chrome gleamed under soft lights, each car a monument to engineering and ego. $200,000 sedans, $500,000 convertibles, their price tags whispering promises of power. The walls shimmered with glass, reflecting the sales team in their crisp suits, moving like sharks through a sea of money. That jazz kept humming, a velvet backdrop to the clink of champagne flutes handed to a guy in a tailored suit who just walked in, gold cufflinks flashing like tiny suns. The staff swarmed him, all smiles and smooth talk, while Jonathan stood alone, unnoticed, a ghost in his own kingdom. He leaned against the coupe, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. The contrast didn't sting, it fueled him. He'd built this place on respect, and right now it was failing his test. They've got no idea. He muttered, voice low, a gravelly edge to it. His eyes narrowed, taking in every detail. The smug grins, the sidelong sneers. How many others had they brushed off like this? How many sales had they lost because they couldn't see past a pair of worn-out shoes? Jonathan Rhys leaned against the silver coupe, its cool metal pressing into his back as he watched the showroom hum with its own rhythm. The jazz still purred through the air, a soft veneer over the sharp edges of this place, but it couldn't mask the undercurrent of judgment rippling through the staff. He'd been standing there for nearly 15 minutes now, arms folded, a silent spectator in a world he'd built. The sales team darted around like hawks, circling their prey, a guy in a tailored suit who'd strolled in adjusting gold cufflinks, his every move screaming money. "Welcome, sir," one of them chirped, voice slick as oil. "What brings you in today? We've got something special in the VIP room care for a test drive." Another handed him a flute of champagne, bubbles, catching the light like tiny trophies. The guy grinned, soaking it up, while the staff tripped over themselves to keep him happy. Jonathan's eyes flicked over the scene, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this play out in a dozen cities, a dozen dealerships. But it still gnawed at him, not the neglect, but the principle. He shifted his weight, scuffed sneakers squeaking faintly against the marble, and caught the eye of a young salesman in a navy suit, Jake, who'd been hovering near a jet-black convertible. Jake glanced his way, then looked again, sizing him up. His gaze snagged on Jonathan's faded jeans, lingered on the worn-out shoes, and his mouth twitched into something halfway between a sneer and a laugh. He shook his head, turning to a coworker with a low mutter. "Guy thinks he's here to shop. Probably can't even afford the floor mats." The coworker chuckled, and they both moved off, dismissing him like dust on a windshield. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, amusement fading into something harder. He'd been ignored before, sure, but this was deliberate, a quiet shove to the margins of their shiny little kingdom. He straightened up, brushing a hand over the coupe's hoodwan. Last time, and took a step toward the reception desk. The woman behind it, Lisa, late 20s with hair ironed straight and a practiced air of boredom, didn't even look up as he approached. Her fingers clicked away at a keyboard, nails painted a glossy red that matched the showroom's vibe. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, voice steady, offering a polite smile. "I'd like to talk to someone about this coupe." Lisa's eyes flicked up for half a second, just long enough to take in his polo and jeans, then dropped back to her screen. "Sales reps are busy," she said flatly, not missing a beat on her typing. "You can wait outside if you're just looking." Her tone wasn't rude, it was worse. It was indifferent, like he was a fly buzzing too close to her coffee. Jonathan tilted his head, smile holding but eyes sharpening. Outside? He echoed, letting the word hang there. She tapped a key harder, still not looking at him. Yeah. We keep the showroom clear for serious buyers. If you're actually interested, we can schedule something. Maybe. The maybe landed like a door slamming shut. He nodded slowly, grip tightening on the desk's edge, though his face stayed calm. Before he could push back, another figure loomed up. Ron, an older salesman with salt and pepper hair and a name tag pinned to his chest. Ron didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake. He just planted himself there, hands on hips, and gave Jonathan a once-over that stopped dead at his sneakers. Sir, he said, voice clipped, this dealership caters to a certain clientele. His eyes met Jonathan's again, steady and cold. You sure you're in the right place? Jonathan held his stare, unblinking. Am I? He shot back, voice low but carrying an edge that made Ron's jaw twitch. A flicker of irritation crossed the salesman's face before he forced a tight-lipped smile. Look, no offense, but maybe you'd be more comfortable at our pre-owned lot. We've got great financing options if that's a concern. The words dripped with condescension, each syllable a shove toward the exit. Jonathan let the insult settle between them, his calm unshaken, but his mind racing. He glanced back at the cufflink guy, now lounging in a $400,000 sedan, while Jake rattled off specs like a tour guide. Then he turned to Ron, voice still even. So you've already decided I don't belong here. Haven't asked what I want. Haven't asked who I am, just figured I'm not worth your time. Ron didn't flinch, but his smile thinned. We know our customers, he said, crossing his arms. You understand. Jonathan's smirk returned, sharper this time. Oh, I think I do. He stepped back, hands slipping into his pockets, watching them both like a hunter sizing up a trap. This wasn't just a snub anymore. It was a line in the sand. The air in the showroom felt heavier now, like the jazz drifting from the speakers had thickened into something you could cut with a knife. Jonathan Rhys stood a step back from the reception desk, hands in his pockets, his scuffed sneakers planted, firm on the marble floor that gleamed like a dark mirror. Ron, the older salesman with the salt and pepper hair, stared him down, arms crossed tight, his thin smile a brittle mask over the irritation simmering underneath. Lisa, behind her keyboard, kept typing, her red nails clicking like a countdown, though her eyes flicked up now and then, sensing the shift. Across the room, Jake and the rest of the sales team hovered around the cufflink guy, their laughter bouncing off the glass walls as he sank deeper into the leather seat of a $400,000 sedan. Champagne flutes clinked. The contrast was a slap in the face, and Jonathan felt it, but he didn't let it show. Not yet. He'd been here 30 minutes now, a ghost in his own empire, watching the staff draw their lines in the sand. Ron's last jab, we know our customers, still hung between them, smug and final, like he'd just won a round. Jonathan tilted his head, letting the silence stretch, his calm a coiled spring ready to snap. All right, he said at last, voice low and deliberate. Let's test that. Say I want that coupe over there. He nodded toward the silver beauty he'd been leaning on, its curves catching the light like liquid metal. What happens then? Ron's smile faltered, just for a second, before he recovered with a dry chuckle. That one? Look, buddy, that's a $320,000 car. We'll just let anyone climb in and kick the tires. If you're serious, we can talk financing, maybe something pre-owned down the road. Lower payments, better fit for... He trailed off, eyes dropping to Jonathan's shoes again, letting the unspoken finish the sentence. Jonathan's smirk sharpened, a glint of steel in it. So that's a no? You're not even gonna ask if I can pay for it? His tone stayed even, that there was a weight to it now. A quiet challenge that made Ron shift his stance. "We've got a process," Ron said, voice tighter. "Keeps things smooth for real buyers. You want to browse. That's fine, just don't touch anything." He stepped closer, looming a little, like he could nudge Jonathan toward the door with sheer presence. Jonathan didn't budge. "Real buyers," he repeated, letting the words roll off his tongue slow and sharp. "And you've already decided I'm not one. Haven't asked my name, haven't asked what I do, just sized me up and called it a day." He glanced at Lisa, who'd stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. "Same deal with you, right? I'm not worth the paperwork?" Lisa blinked, caught off guard, then shrugged. "It's busy. We prioritize. You get it." Her voice was flat, but her eyes darted to Ron, like she was passing the buck. Jonathan nodded, slow and deliberate, like he was piecing together a puzzle they didn't even know they were part of. "I get it," he said, then turned his gaze back to Ron. "But here's what I don't get. If I walked out right now and I was ready to drop $500,000 today, what did you just lose?" Ron opened his mouth, then shut it, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Jake, overhearing from across the room, laughed a sharp, nervous bark. $500,000? Come on, man, let's not play pretend here. He sauntered over, arms loose, confidence dripping off him. "You're not fooling anyone in that getup." Jonathan's eyes locked on Jake, steady and unblinking, and for the first time, something dangerous flashed in them. He reached into his pocket, slow as sin, and pulled out his phone. The room didn't stop. Champagne still flowed, jazz still hummed, but a chill crept in, subtle as a shadow stretching across the floor. He scrolled through his contacts, thumb pausing over a name, and pressed call. It rang twice. "I need you here," he said, voice low, firm. "Now." He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Ron frowned, crossing his arms tighter. "Who are you calling? Buddy from the scrapyard?" His laugh was forced, but it died fast when Jonathan didn't bite. Lisa leaned forward slightly, curiosity breaking through her boredom. Jake just smirked, leaning against a nearby car, like this was all a game. Then the glass doors hissed open again, and the showroom went still. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided up to the curb outside, its polished body swallowing the afternoon light like a void. The valet scrambled to open the rear door, and out stepped a tall man in a charcoal suit, his presence cutting through the room like a blade. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver, understated, scanned the space through the glass, then pushed the doors wide. His leather shoes tapped the marble with purpose, each step echoing like a gavel. The sales team froze, suits suddenly straighter, ties adjusted in a panic. Ron's jaw tightened, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. The man David Langford, regional manager, locked eyes with Jonathan and broke into a small, respectful smile. "Sir," he said, voice smooth but weighted. "Apologies for the delay." He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped in front of him, waiting. Jake's smirk vanished. Lisa's hands dropped from the keyboard. Ron took a step back, confusion twisting into something close to fear. I'm sorry," he stammered, turning to David. "I don't believe we've met." David's face stayed blank. "I'm David Langford, regional manager, and I believe you're the one I'm here to see." His eyes flicked to Jonathan, then back to Ron. Letting the weight settle, Jonathan stepped forward, calm as ever, but his voice carried a new edge. "So tell me," he said, cool and deliberate, "this is how we treat people here?" The question landed like a hammer, and the room held its breath. They didn't know who he was, not yet, but the storm had just broken through the glass. The showroom stood frozen, a snapshot of chaos caught in the glare of the chandelier lights. David Langford's words, This is how we treat people here? Still echoed off the glass walls, sharp and heavy, like a judge's gavel slamming. Down. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom loomed outside, its shadow spilling through the doors, a silent witness to the unraveling scene. Jonathan Rhys stood at the center of it all, hands in his pockets, his faded polo and scuffed sneakers a stark rebellion against the polished suits surrounding him. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire that made the air feel electric. Ron, the salt and pepper salesman, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His arms dropped to his sides, hands twitching as sweat beaded on his forehead. Jake, the cocky kid in the navy suit, had gone pale, his smirk wiped clean, replaced by a wide-eyed stare that darted between Jonathan and David. Lisa, behind the reception desk, gripped the edge of her chair, her red nails digging into the leather, like she was holding on for dear life. The cufflink guy, oblivious, sipped his champagne in the sedan, but even his salesman paused, sensing the shift. The jazz kept playing, a cruelly cheerful backdrop to the silence choking the room. David turned to Jonathan, his charcoal suit crisp and unyielding. "Mr. Rhys," he said, voice low but firm, "how would you like to proceed?" The name hit like a thunderclap. Ron's head snapped up, his mouth falling open. Jake stumbled back a step, catching himself on a car hood. Lisa's eyes widened, a sharp breath escaping her lips. "Mr. Rhys." The pieces clicked into place, jagged and unforgiving. This wasn't some drifter. This was the man who owned it all, the dealership, the chain, the empire they strutted around in like it was their own. Jonathan let the silence stretch, his gaze drifting over each of them, Ron's panic, Jake's shock, Lisa's dread. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the squeak of his sneakers on the marble slicing through the tension. "So," he said, voice cool as steel, "this is how it works here. You look at someone, decide they don't fit, and shove them out the door. No questions, no chance. Just a quick once-over, and you're done." He paused, locking eyes with Ron. "Tell me, how much attention did that guy over there get when he walked in?" He nodded toward the cufflink man, still lounging in the sedan, blissfully unaware. Ron swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. No one answered. Jonathan's gaze shifted to Jake. "And how much did I get?" Jake opened his mouth, then shut it, his bravado crumbling like wet sand. Ron tried to step in, voice shaky. "Sir, we didn't realize. This is all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Jonathan cut him off, his chuckle low and dry. "You didn't misunderstand anything. You saw me and made a call. You figured I wasn't worth your time." He turned to David, calm but commanding. "How much does this place pull in a year?" David didn't hesitate. "Roughly $28 million, sir." Jonathan nodded, letting that sink in. He faced the staff again, his voice steady but piercing. $28 million. That's what you're playing with here. And you've decided for yourselves who's worth it and who's not. He stepped closer to Ron, not threatening, just close enough to make the man shrink. "What happens if I'd been some regular Joe, ready to drop $500,000 today? What if I'd walked out because you couldn't be bothered? You gonna let that kind of money slip through your fingers over a pair of old shoes?" Ron's face went red, then white. He shook his head, grasping for words. We didn't mean we were just... Didn't mean what?" Jonathan pressed, his tone unrelenting. "Didn't mean to get caught?" Ron had nothing left, his hands trembling at his sides. Jonathan sighed, running a hand over his jaw, disappointment settling into his features. "I've been in this game almost 20 years, he said, voice softening but carrying a weight that pinned them all. "And I've learned one thing. Respect doesn't cost a damn thing. You don't get to pick and choose who deserves it. You give it to everyone, because you never know who's standing in front of you." He turned to David, his decision made. "Names," he said simply. David nodded, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "I've got them." The air shifted again, panic rippling through the staff like a shockwave. Lisa's hands clenched tighter. Jake looked ready to bolt. Ron's voice cracked as he stepped forward. "Sir, please, we made a mistake. We were just trying to keep things smooth." Jonathan raised a hand, and Ron stopped cold. "A mistake," he repeated, letting it hang there. "And how many other mistakes have you made?" "How many? People walked in here and got the same treatment because they didn't look the part?" He shook his head. "That's not how this works. Not in my house." David stepped forward, his voice flat and final. "Effective immediately. Everyone involved today is terminated. Ron, Jake, Lisa, you're done." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Ron's mouth dropped open, a strangled, "Wait, you can't," spilling out before David cut him off. "This isn't up for debate," David said. "We don't run our business like this." Jake backed away, shaking his head like he could outrun it. Lisa's shoulders slumped, her face a mask of disbelief. Ron tried one last time, desperation bleeding through. "Please, this was just, we didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but cutting deeper than any shout. "That's the problem." He turned to David. "Send a company-wide memo. Make sure everyone gets this loud and clear." David nodded. "Absolutely." Jonathan glanced around one last time, taking in the stunned faces. The champagne flutes now abandoned on a counter, the jazz still mocking the silence. "This isn't about the money," he said, his tone soft but firm. "It never was. It's about respect." He let that settle, then added, "And you just learned that the hard way." With that, he turned and headed for the doors, leaving the wreckage of their arrogance behind him. David stepped forward, his voice flat and final. "Effective immediately. Everyone involved today is terminated. Ron, Jake, Lisa, you're done." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Ron's mouth dropped open, a strangled, "Wait, you can't," spilling out before David cut him off. "This isn't up for debate," David said. "We don't run our business like this." Jake backed away, shaking his head like he could outrun it. Lisa's shoulders slumped, her face a mask of disbelief. Ron tried one last time, desperation bleeding through. "Please, this was just, we didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but cutting deeper than any shout. "That's the problem." He turned to David. "Send a company-wide memo. Make sure everyone gets this loud and clear." David nodded. "Absolutely." Jonathan glanced around one last time, taking in the stunned faces. The champagne flutes now abandoned on a counter, the jazz still mocking the silence. "This isn't about the money," he said, his tone soft but firm. "It never was. It's about respect." He let that settle, then added, "And you just learned that the hard way." With that, he turned and headed for the doors, leaving the wreckage of their arrogance behind him.